In this lecture, I want to try to lay out some of the developments and contours of early modern Catholicism to kind of tell us a little bit about what the church looked like in this particular period. My main focus for this will be on the importance of saints in the life of early modern Catholicism and what a few of them brought to the church, along with a deeper explanation on the part of the impact of scholarship that the arrival of the Protestants had, and some other developments in both science and theology as we move into the 17th century. So there's quite a bit for us to talk about to get a good sense of early modern Catholicism. So let's go ahead and just dig right in. The 16th and 17th century is an age of saints for the church. There are many saints, and I can't really talk about all of the saints that emerge in this period, so feel free to add some of your own to the channels to help us get a bigger picture of some of the many wonderful saints who emerged at this time, which is always a good providential point of contemplation to think about. When the church is challenged most robustly, we are often immediately have a harvest of some of the most amazing individuals responding to the will of God in their lives. One thing we should say, though, about the saints is that the process of becoming canonized as a saint becomes much more formal in this period, especially with the establishment of the Congregation for Sacred Rites and Ceremonies under Sixtus V and his overhaul of the Curia. This greater papal control of the process means that the bar is much higher for ending up on the calendar in the 16th and the 17th century than it had been before. Before, you needed a saintly person, you needed a good vita of someone, you needed a community dedicated to that person's memory, and then there was some double checking on the part of Rome after the 13th century. But this whole process gets much more robust and much more formalized. It looks like you generally need civic support as well in order to get your saint through this process. Also, the Inquisition is going to be used in this process. It was no longer sufficient to get on the calendar if you had miracles attributed to you. You now had to live a life that was completely without blemish and that was worthy of being held up. So that's one of the reasons why the Inquisition was frequently used in this process as well. The saints that I'm going to talk about themselves had a great impact on the church, but the holding up of the saints, particularly in the early 17th century, was a way for the church to demonstrate to the wider world, to the Protestant world, but definitely to the Catholic world, that the Catholic ideal was possible, that holiness in this life was possible. And here are these examples. And so the saints have always been an important part of Catholic identity, especially from late antiquity forward, but they will become even more so again in the 16th and into the 17th century. Saints' lives have become even more popular, even though they were already popular, especially in the 17th century. And the beginning of one of the most long-running intellectual projects in the church begins here in 1607, which is a society called the Bollandists, which is started initially by Herbert Roswinde, but continued by Jean Bolland, who gives the name to them, the Bollandists. And this is the Acta Sanctorum, which is a collection of all um, primary source materials about the saints organized according to the calendar, and that project didn't come to its completion until the 20th century. Finally, the December volumes were published in mid-20th century. So the idea here with the kind of reading of the saints, the upholding of the saints on the part of the church is that if men and women could become saints, so could you. And this puts the teachings of Francis de Sales is another reflection of this idea that holiness was possible. The saints were important. It was a place where heaven and earth met in an incarnate individual. The Catholic world would pulsate with stories of the miraculous in and having to do with the saints and with Eucharistic miracles. And it was really, you can say that early modern Catholicism was robustly incarnational. The veil between the human and the divine worlds was very thin, so to speak, in the vision of early modern Catholicism. And you compare that robustly to um, a vision of, say, the Reformed tradition, Calvinism, where it was about good teachings and and Jesus was locked up in heaven and wouldn't come until the end of time. And the only thing that we had was good teaching, and we had to get rid of all attempts to depict God and the saints through iconoclasm. So it's the materiality and the interpenetration of the transcendent into the material order was a part of the response to Protestantism and an essential ingredient in what early modern Catholicism looked like. But let's talk a little bit about some of these saints, for they were important figures on their own right, not just as examples of the overall desire to promote the saints. Charles Borromeo, he becomes, as the slide says, the example of a Reformed post-conciliar bishop. He's the Archbishop of Milan from 1560 to his death, and he's the first Archbishop of Milan to have been resident in his diocese in the past 80 years. And he drew his inspiration as Archbishop of Milan from Ambrose, and he worked actively in opposition to the Spanish governors when necessary. And why is he a poster boy for the Council of Trent? Because he did all that Council of Trent asked him to do. He held provincial and diocesan synods. He did parish visitations. He himself personally helped with the commission for the Catechism and also the commission for the Breviary. He founded seminaries, including the Swiss College. When the plague struck Milan, he visited the plague victims as best as when no one else would. He introduced confessionals into churches and he took robust control over confessors within his own diocese. He was preaching constantly and reforming constantly. In fact, his reforms were not welcomed on the part of one of the groups that was being reformed, that someone attempted to assassinate him. A Humiliati friar shot him while he was saying Mass. He survived, but he continued to still reform everything that he could with the full powers of Trent behind him. So his vigor and his effort for the Diocese of Milan left a lasting impression of how a bishop ought to run a diocese. And so his letters, his writings, his sermons were all collected and then distributed as an example for how to implement the Council of Trent and how to be a good bishop in the early modern world. Key for Borromeo in all of his efforts was education, and this taps in well to the image of early modern Catholicism with the paradigm of instruct thoroughly. So he tapped on new orders and helped them to develop, like the Ursulines. And at his death, there were 740 schools in his archdiocese with 3,000 teachers and 40,000 students. And education will really be seen as one of the, just like the Jesuit colleges, one of the primary efforts for renewing the society. And in all of this, Charles Borromeo actually started out before he had his deeper conversion as part of the problem. He came to authority within the church at an overly young age. He was had an appointment due to nepotism. He was an example, so to speak, of corruption in the church. What happened to him? He had a deep spiritual conversion himself, in part due to going on the spiritual exercises of Ignatius, and he rebelled against his family and had himself clandestinely ordained a priest and then launched into a reforming career that we know him for today. So Charles Borromeo started as part of the problem and became the poster boy of the solution for the life of the church. Turning our attention from Italy to Spain, we have two of the most important mystics in the life of the church who emerge in the 16th century, themselves collaborators for the reforming of the Carmelites, Teresa reforming a female branch and John attempting to reform a male branch, although receiving greater friction than Teresa did. One of the reasons Teresa of Avila was able to clean up her order is she had robust support from both Philip II and from the Pope, so it's hard to resist both royal and papal and mystical authority when it comes to cleaning up her order. So you can locate both Teresa and John in this overall pattern of the push for observant movements. But why her great benefit, of course, to the church comes from her mystical writings, which have continued to teach people the importance of how to pray and ways in which to pray throughout the ages. But she herself, once she had her own sort of deeper personal conversion and began reforming the order late in her life, would never stop traveling around, expanding the reform and founding new convents and monasteries built on a more robust image for how to be a Carmelite. John of the Cross is, of course, the poet of the age, a mystic as well, drawing inspiration and in dialogue with Teresa of Avila. He practiced a strictness of the rule as much as he was personally allowed. He tried to help others in the Carmelite order see the importance of living more strictly according to the rule of Carmel, but that would end up getting him into bitter battles with the best interest in his orders, and including getting himself imprisoned as part of the fight. So John of the Cross, his great contribution to the church, of course, is his poetry, The Dark Night of the Soul, along with much of his other poetry, really part of the kind of foundation, the golden age of Spanish literature is being laid down in this period. And whether it's going to be Miguel Cervantes with something, a text like Don Quixote, or John of the Cross's poetry, you really kind of see a new consciousness, Spanish consciousness coming into existence in these 2 centuries from 1492 forward. So there's obviously way more I could say about Teresa and John in all of this, but just to kind of remind us that there are lots of different ways in which the saints can influence the church. They can be reformers of orders, but they can also be mystics. They can also be bishops who do their jobs. So there's lots of examples of how to be saintly at this time. The scholar Pochohizia uh, divides all of the Catholic world into kind of 3 zones at this period, and it's really kind of a useful paradigm. One is that there is the church triumphant, and that's the regions where Catholicism emerges out of the 16th century with very little successful challenge from the Protestants. And so that would be places like Spain and Italy. Then there's a zone which Hesia calls the church militant, and that's the kind of borderland between the Protestants and the Catholics where things are much more contested. And that would be parts of France and certainly the Empire, in particular in Switzerland as well. So that's kind of the places where Catholicism and Protestantism are fighting with each other. And then the last is the last zone is the church persecuted. And so I don't want to bypass at all to point out that there were many places in where the Catholicism was being robustly persecuted, such as in England, and this led to many martyrdoms as well. And particularly should be highlighted was the that in England, especially under the reign of Elizabeth, to be a priest in England was practically a death penalty, and it was a felony for people to shelter priests. But yet, at the same time, the English clergy established a seminary at Douai and continued to provide priests for the underground church there in England. There were some attempts to help, with obviously with the Armada, or even in a twisted way Guy Fawkes, but there's many martyrs like Edmund Campion of the Jesuits who continued to try to bring the sacraments and bring the faith to the English, particularly in the north. And quietly, some of those noble families would hold on to their Catholicism all the way down until when toleration was finally allowed for their faith in the 19th century. So there's kind of these 3 different zones. If take an example from the church militant zone, the church where a battle is formally active, that brings our attention to St. Francis de Sales. He is Bishop of Geneva, obviously not resident in Geneva, but in nearby Annecy. He actually did visit Geneva 3 times and had discussions with Calvin's successor, Theodore Beza. And what did he do while Bishop of Geneva? Well, he promoted instruction and preaching. He traveled around. He preached against the Protestants. He took up a pamphlet war against the Protestants with some of the powerful language I included in the previous lecture. But he had a powerful devotion to the poor. And it really seems that his love of the poor and his active charity for them and his willingness to speak with them and to help them really helped win the support of the Savoy peasantry. and keep them from falling into the error of Calvinism. Here was their bishop, and he was actively caring for them, and he was willing to preach to them in French or in Latin, whatever language that they had. In particular, he promoted the devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus as part of this strategy, because for Francis de Sales, he wanted to bring people to the faith by reminding them about love and not fear. And this comes out very clearly in his introduction to the devout life. In his introduction to the devout life, his famous text of his famous spiritual text, it does recommend a somewhat monastic spirituality and austerity for the laity, but really the text is about finding ways that all aspects of society could find a path to holiness. And the text itself was not written for monks and then just read by laity. It was actually written for a lay woman, as part of the rhetorical audience of the text. There's really a great emphasis in Francis de Sales' writings on the importance of the will and therefore on the importance of self-denial. So there really was a lot about rolling up your sleeves and working hard so that you could train your will so that you could cooperate with grace in Francis de Sales. The teachings of Francis played an important role eventually in the development of the so-called French school, like Cardinal Beroulet, who would establish a French oratory after the pattern of Philip of Neri, but also you could see traces of it in the Sulpicians or Vincent de Paul. What Berulle and the Sulpicians all had in common was a dedication to realizing the priestly formation called for by Trent, with their principal theme of being with total servitude to God. And Francis de Sales is sort of the wellspring for many of the trends within this French school. Powerful, forceful, willful Catholic monarchs were also part of life in early modern Catholicism, and that will continue unabated as we move into the age of absolutism. Catholic monarchs did play their part in implementing renewal and reform within the church, and probably the best example is Philip II of Spain, and then briefly Portugal as well. Philip II himself did not always delegate authority well, and he may have kind of worked himself into something of an early grave or incapacity. But nevertheless, while Philip was active in the mid 16th century, he was one of the most powerful forces on behalf of Christianity, both in the Mediterranean, in the attempts to reclaim England for the church, and of course in spreading the faith to the territories of New Spain and New Portugal as well. He continued Cardinal Jimenez's program of reform of the regulars. He established seminaries following Trent. He consistently backed Trent so long as it didn't interfere with royal prerogatives. He had catechisms produced in the vernacular. He had vernacular carols composed to distribute to the people. He was instrumental in organizing Christian forces for the victory at Lepanto in 1571. He briefly tried to take over charity work, but he was challenged by the confraternities and realized that he should allow charity to continue to be practiced by the people directly themselves. Um, but of course, probably what Spain is most known for is a mechanism that is the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition is controlled by the Spanish crown and is an agent for the Spanish crown. Its most important focus in its early years of the 16th century was using it as a tool against the conversos, those that had converted to Christianity from either Jewish or Muslim ancestry. But once that kind of faded in the eyes of the Spanish authorities, the Inquisition would switch over to being a tool as well of providing moral and clerical discipline, calling up clerics for misbehaving just as much as for having bad doctrinal errors. The Inquisition in Spain, no one was exempt from it. Even the Archbishop of Toledo could be called up by the Inquisition in Spain. There's plenty of high spectacle involved with this. This is, of course, the auto de fe, the formal burning of a heretic as part of the pageantry to remind people about the dangers of heterodoxy and the dangers of departing from the faith. After its initial intensity, as part of the process of creating Spanish identity after 1491, it slows down in sort of its intensity in what the Spanish Inquisition was after. But the current reports about it is that from 1540 to 1700, the Spanish Inquisition committed 826 to flames. So they gave over 826 to be killed, of which 778 of those were burned in effigy. So even the Spanish Inquisition, for the reputation that it has and for the way that we think about it, and the way that it's often portrayed in Hollywood, even the Spanish Inquisition was in a way more merciful and more mild in its entire operation for a century and a half than even just a decade in the reign of Elizabeth. So the scholars continue to keep working on the Spanish Inquisition and to kind of gain a better understanding and picture of what's going on. And there is a fair amount of good scholarship out there now that's reprising a lot of what we think about it. If you're more interested in it, start with Carlos Ire's Reformations text, and then you can follow his bibliography from there. But why does this legend of the Spanish Inquisition exist? Why is it that Philip II is seen to be such an awful person? Precisely because he and his Habsburg cousins were the great defenders of Catholicism against political incursion by the Protestant states. And so it's because of the political rivalries between the Catholic states and the Protestant states that the Protestants latched on to the defamation, to the amplification of the horrors of an evil Catholicism, of which the Inquisition played an important role in that, along with pretty much everything Spanish, if you're coming from an English perspective. The fear always being that the Spanish were coming and they were going to seize England at some point. Philip, after his marriage with Catherine, always did retain the title of King of England, although he wasn't able to make good on that with the Armada. But Philip is an example of a reform-minded king who is using all of his authority to promote the faith in this early modern Catholic sort of way of worship uniformly, instruct thoroughly, and as with Philip, police intensely with the use of the Inquisition. You are going to be good or else in Philip's realm. The devotional life of the early modern church, Tridentine devotion, if we want to call it that, extends and supercharges many of the trends of the late medieval devotional life. So many of the things that were important to Catholics in the late Middle Ages become even more important to Catholics in the early modern period. Things like confraternities and liturgical processions and the saints and charitable works and pilgrimages and all of those things. There's an even more intensity about doing those things as we move into the early modern period. The big push in the early modern period is especially of the internal indies, so to speak, the internal missions of the observant movements in particular, is to get people to frequent communion and confession more often. So the true kind of the way that a preacher measured his success in the early modern period was in numbers of confessions they could inspire in their audience. We do see going on in this period in terms a great rise in Eucharistic devotion. Obviously, the benediction becomes more important at this time. The 40 hours devotion emerges at this particular time, and it makes a lot of sense. If you think about the great denigration of the Eucharist on the part of the Protestants, then the Catholics double down in their Eucharistic veneration. In addition to this Eucharistic devotion, we have lots of stories of Eucharistic miracles during this period, and often the stories of the Eucharistic miracles begin with desecration caused by a Protestant or other opponents of the faith. But we do see within the Mass The Mass is going to stay in Latin. It's kind of the question of vernacular is left to the Holy Father, and it's not, it's briefly discussed at Trent, but they decide to keep it in Latin. Probably, most likely because the Protestants were using the vernacular. So the Mass will stay in Latin, and we do see scholars of popular Christianity do talk about more of a movement towards the Mass being a moment of private devotion instead of a celebration that you're collectively doing together. So this is the new kind. This is usually explained in shorthand with the switch linguistically to I'm going to hear Mass, in terms of I'm not going to go to Mass or be a part of Mass or do Mass. It's no, I'm going to hear Mass in the English language tradition. Really, if the way you can kind of one way of processing Tridentine devotion, early modern Catholicism at this period is that it is that interpenetration of the transcendental with the material, the robust incarnational perspective that I talked about before, and that manifests itself very clearly with the form of art that emerges at this time to express that, which is the Baroque. Baroque art is about light and shadow, heaven and earth, action, movement, and it's always big. It always has to be big in order to be successful, especially. So the Protestants obviously had rejected religious art, and the Catholic response was a total opposite. It was a near, basically ornament everything project and build everything on a monumental and dizzying scale, just like old St. Peter's. The point, or the new St. Peter's. The point, for those of you that have been into St. Peter's, the moment you walk into it, you are overwhelmed and you are lifted up. It pulls you up because it's so monumental and it makes you to look up and kind of realize emotionally that you're in a greater reality. And that's sort of the overall focus of Baroque art. It's sensual, it's lacking in restraint, and it's a hallmark of Catholic art and music, really, in the 17th century. Lots of energy going on into music at the time as well, but there's sort of all this movement, all this action, all this doing, all of those expressions apply really well to early modern devotional life as well. And this, of course, cost a great deal in order to achieve. For those of you that read the letters of Michelangelo, you can see how much the cost of this patronage really was. A lot of the people's wealth went into these projects. It's important to realize the sheer force of will that was required to make projects like Old St. Peter's be or New St. Peter's to be successful in the first place. All the finding of the marble, the finding of the artist, the doing all of the work, the amount of effort that went into this shows us that this is the art of the time was seen as one of the most important pastoral expressions of the faith. So the Sixtus the Fourth original idea of a Gospels in stone, borrowing from sort of Gregory the Great's original idea of the point of art, continues into the early modern period, and even more so. What I've given you here is obviously the piazza in front of St. Peter's, but also I wanted to throw on the slide for you Brunelleschi's David, which I think really exemplifies the early modern Catholic perspective really well. If you look at Michelangelo's David is kind of standing there. He's self-assured. He looks like he's kind of a pretty confident guy. If you look at Donatello's David, he looks sickly. But if you look at Brunelleschi's David, you can see that he's got grit, he's got determination, but there's movement to the statue. It's like you can feel that he's almost about to release that stone. So it's really just another one of these examples that I want to get across of the kind of intense activity on the part of early modern Catholicism. It was really about doing things, building things, decorating things, doing things, movement, helping people move from the darkness to the light, whether that's through art or that's through the devotional practices themselves. And education, especially, will become seen not just as something that's done in art, but education itself will become seen as an important act of charity. And this will lead to the establishment of many of the educational orders that will come out, especially emerging in the 17th century at this time. The conflict with the Protestants did have an effect on scholarship. The main impact is that there's censorship all around. The Protestant states attempt to censor the presses to keep Catholic books from being printed, and the Catholic states attempt to censor other presses to keep Protestant books from being printed. So editions were being created with altered from the original text everywhere across early modern Europe. And the censorship, some of it was quality, some of it was not so quality. But the really kind of the goal is of defending people from bad ideas wasn't just in the Catholic world, it was all across early modern Europe as well. One of the first places where Protestants and Catholics get into an intellectual fight after theology is in history. So this opening salvo was from a Lutheran, Matthias Flacius Illyricus, who wrote a book called The Centuries, which basically, century by century, traces how the church got worse and worse after Constantine. And the response to Illyricus comes from Cesare Baronius, who is a member of Philip Neri's newly founded Oratorians. And Philip Neri has Baronius respond, and Baronius writes his Annals, which is a year-by-year account of how the church did just fine. Thank you very much. And so really kind of this, what happens here early on in this fight between Illyricus and Baronius will repeat itself in historiography down to the 20th century, if not even forward. There's the Protestant historiography can find nothing good, especially in the Middle Ages, and the Catholic historiography it chooses not to focus on any of the bad and says that it was all good in the Middle Ages. So a correction is obviously needed to both, although I obviously would say that Baronius is closer to the truth than Illyricus. One of the most important figures in Catholic scholarship at this time in direct response to the Protestants is Robert Bellarmine of the Society of Jesus, and his text, The Disputation Against the Heretics of the Times, is a full systematic rebuttal of every major Protestant thought he heard of at the time. So successful were these attacks that many Protestant universities established chairs solely dedicated to rebutting the thought of Robert Bellarmine, S.J., and for his efforts and work, he was eventually made a cardinal. But in terms of one of the other impacts on scholarship was, of course, the index of prohibited books. So if you're not allowed to read something or there's books that are prohibited, then obviously that could hamper intellectual development. When the index was run well, when Bellarmine was on it, then it wasn't as much of a problem, but it wasn't always run well. And particularly when the cardinal in charge of it lacked intellectual talent himself, it could lead to a squashing of some things. In particular, anything that was seen to be somewhat critical of the papacy would eventually end up on the index. So works like Boccaccio, Petrarch, Machiavelli, Erasmus would end on the index. Even Bellarmine would end up on the index as well because of his controversies, because you could read Protestant thought in there. So the 16th century popes were determined to root out pagan Rome and replace it fully with Christian Rome. So that's why they went after a number of the Italian Renaissance figures. But overall, the scholarship says that it appears the effect was not too detrimental to Catholic intellectual life, because scholars have been able to see that lots of the requests to read forbidden books were granted on a frequent basis. So it was true with the canonization process, and with Baronius, we see merging at this time a flourishing emergence, really, of historical sciences, especially coming out of France. The real intellectual weight of the Catholic world was beginning to shift towards France in the 17th century. Figures like Mabillon and Bolland really took the kind of humanist impulse of ad fontes and of reading text in their historical context and used that to launch their own projects for mining the ancient sources for a better understanding of themselves and as a counter to the Protestants, because the more you dig in history, the less Protestant Christianity can seem. But the efforts of scholars like Mabillon and Bolland would continue to be a source of intellectual renewal, this time drawing the intellectual renewal from the past. But they're doing this now in a much more rigorous way. So from the early fights with Illyricus and Baronius, we really do start to see in the 17th century the emergence of what we could say is a much more disciplined um, aspect of doing history. Coinciding with this development in historical sciences is, of course, the origin of science, the scientific turn, scientific revolution. There's lots of different terms you can give to this. So, what is this scientific turn that occurs in the early modern period? Most of these individuals that are called scientists would probably classify themselves as natural philosophers, because what they were doing is they were just seeking the truth of things. I suppose the most representative of thought at this time would have to be René Descartes, who would declare all things ought to be doubted. But the purpose of Descartes' project was, at least one of them anyway, was to resolve the religious difficulties of the day and give Christianity a firm grounding in nature. He was after truth and thought it was attainable through math and a rebuilding of the whole metaphysical system. And while many will follow him in his metaphysics and his proof of God's existence, his long-term followers of his methodology of doubt would be the skeptics of the later 17th and 18th century that would feed into the Enlightenment. But what the scientific kind of turn was really all about was not so much Rene Descartes and his math, but was a turn towards a type of knowledge which was about measurement. So math and observation became the path to achieve the truth, or at least lowercase t truth, that all could assent to. And this, of course, brings me to the Galileo affair. So while there is a rise of some atheists following a republication of Lucretius, and there are skeptics and maybe some proto-deists, Galileo was none of these, as you can see in his letter that you had to read. Galileo Galilei would contribute many discoveries to the human understanding in the realms of physics and astronomy, but probably the most controversial was his use of the telescope to observe that the celestial bodies were not perfect. So what's going to go on here, at least in terms of astronomy, is that the ancient cosmology that had been in place with the ancient Greeks and the Romans and through the medieval period says that the further you get away from Earth, the more perfect things become, because you get farther away from matter, and so the things would be more perfect. So looking through a telescope and seeing imperfections on the moon challenges this theory directly. This is kind of what's happening on a regular basis with early modern science. It's that they are finding that many of the observations of their auctoritas, of their authoritative authors that medieval education was built on, were wrong. So, like Vasileus is discovering the limitations of Galen's anatomy. So there really are lots of examples. The Greeks are being proven wrong, and it seems to be a thing of to do in the 16th century. So that is kind of the greater tension that's going on. Is sort of the way of doing knowledge was built on authoritative texts. Well, what happens when those authoritative texts are incorrect? And that leads us to much of the tensions of the 16th and 17th century and will help us understand what went on with the Galileo affair. In the meantime, it's important to note that Tycho Brahe had created a workable geocentric model that fit with all of the math and observations at the time. So that although his student would eventually reject Brahe system, his posited system for the heliocentric model showed that it could still work. Okay, so that's an important piece in the Galileo affair to understand, is that when Galileo starts saying that the sun is at the center of the solar system is at the center of the solar system and that the Earth moves around it, Tycho Brahe had mathematically demonstrated that the heliocentric model is still workable, that it still works with some tweaking that was put in place. So I remind this to say that what Galileo is going to say that about the Earth moving around the sun is a theory in Galileo's day. What Galileo had, besides his theory about the Earth moving around the sun, is that he had a problem with angering philosophers. He would frequently fight with them and attack their over-reliance on Aristotle. He never received a degree, but he ended up with powerful patrons and was able to get jobs at the universities, which made them even more grumpy. And he frequently took pot shots at Greeks on frequent occasions and derided philosophy, championing only math and observation as the way to understand nature. It is actually his philosopher opponents who bring scripture into the equation when it comes to the heliocentric versus the geocentric model. What happened is that the controversy, once scripture was brought into it, once someone started preaching that Galileo was a heretic, he was sort of commissioned by the philosophers to do so. This brought Galileo to the attention of the Inquisition, and the inquisitor that investigated Galileo was no less than Robert Bellarmine. All right, what happened? The end of this was that Galileo was told that he could not teach as proven what was a theory, and that the old interpretation of the scripture by the fathers of a geocentric model was to be held until full evidence was presented. For this, so that was what Bellarmine said. What you said is a theory, but in the meantime, uh, we're going to hold to the geocentric model until evidence says otherwise. And that's the affidavit that's agreed on with Galileo, and that's where matters stay for 20 years. Incidentally, Galileo would require either the calculus of Newton or Leibniz, depending on how you read the whole plagiarism debate, along with a couple other additional observations to be able to definitively prove the heliocentric model. Some of those things didn't even come available into the 19th century. But 20 years after Galileo got in his kind of first scrape with the Inquisition, he will write a dialogue where he will attempt to prove the merits of the heliocentric model over the geocentric model. Basically, it's a dialogue. It says nothing definitive, but the heliocentric interlocutor is extremely sophisticated and very clever and very good, and the geocentric interlocutor is practically an idiot. So it's it's although it's a dialogue, Galileo is walking really close to the line of trying to prove the heliocentric model without further sort of evidence. He also, for some reason, got the displeasure of the Pope at the time, and so his file was cracked open to see what was going on. And in his file, there was a note that was not signed by Bellarmine, and we don't really quite know how the note got into the file, claiming that Galileo couldn't even teach about the heliocentric model in any way, not the teach as a theory versus teach as given, which Bellarmine and Galileo had come to an agreement before. In response to this note in his affidavit, he recants of his position, and he'll spend the last years of his life sequestered in a Tuscan estate with access to books and his family, and not really a prison at all. So in all of this, what's going on here? Is this the martyrdom of Galileo for the sake of empiricism? Is it Galileo just getting caught by the rough treatment of the philosophers and being at the mercy of political intrigue? It really just, all of the different Galileos that have been launched over the time are fascinating themselves to study, but usually reveal more about the time and the scholar who's putting forward a version of the Galileo affairs. It just seems, at least in my reading, that it is a series of unfortunate events with strong personalities that will eventually lead to Galileo's being condemned and for his writings to end up on the index. Does this prove that the church is against science? No, because it's the only exception to the general rule of an adoption on the part of science and an updating of the Greek knowledge base based on new observations and math that the church figures participated in robustly. The Jesuits had a observatory in Rome. They sent Galileo lots of congratulatory notes for many of the things that he discovered. So it really does seem that what happened to Galileo had a lot to do with politics and personality. The overall trend of the relationship between the early modern church and the church in general towards science is overall that learned monks and clergy would continue to contribute to knowledge of the created order. Only in this question of geocentrism and heliocentrism did it become kind of a political football, and maybe in that issue it did slow down scholarship for a little while. But there's lots of things to study with the Galileo affair. It's a very complicated situation, but the short story is in all of this that the Galileo affair means absolutely nothing to the relationship of the church to learned science. What it really has to do with is it becomes a football. The opponents of the church like to throw around in order to besmirch us for making a poor decision on the part of the Inquisition 20 years after the famous meeting between Galileo and Bellarmine. In terms of the big question of this course so far, which is how do we get to heaven, uh, we thought the Council of Trent maybe had finished this answer for us, but no, apparently it doesn't. So in the 16th and 17th century, we're about coming to grips with orthodoxy. Well, I've talked a little bit about some Protestant efforts to do this, like the Lutheran internal fighting being solved with the Formula of Concord, or the Calvinist fight that led to the Synod of Dort. And Trent does do something similar to that, but theologians continued to press on. So what we can see in early modern theology is a quest for unity and a quest for clarity as what's going on. In a world that had been turned upside down, you get to see an explosion of political theology as well, an attempt to reshape and re-understand the world as the old rules did not apply, or at least were contested. And so it's not just Locke and Hobbes who are attempting to redefine the relationship between men in the 17th century and the 16th century, but you also have figures like Bellarmine and Bossuet, as you could see in the extra readings if you wanted to, much of which, from both Catholic and Protestant circles, political thought would be important ingredients in the emergence of the revolutionary ideas. Probably most importantly, something that's in Bellarmine as well, is that authority comes from God through the people. This came from the Middle Ages, but Bellarmine gives it a new thrust with his political writings. One of the other tasks that faced theologians in the 16th and 17th century was the massive task of synthesizing 400 years of scholasticism along with the insights of the Council of Trent and condemning Protestants along the way. And so these theologians, especially of the 17th and 18th century, are sometimes called the manualists. And I don't think they're given the credit they deserve because they took this long tradition and turned it into a workable mass. And in the meantime, they also created further theological specializations for greater clarity and focus, such as dogmatics, morals, and political theology. I think in particular, figures like Melchior Cano were very useful in sorting out in the realm of theology what was dogma and what was speculation and making the whole system digestible and teachable. And so bringing clarity to this big, massive mess that we discussed at the beginning about late medieval theology is the work of the manualists. And without them, we wouldn't be nearly as sure about what we think as we think we are. So, while we've already discussed the issue at some length, we have to go back to the question of how we are saved, how we get to heaven. And this is the grand debate of the 16th and 17th century. So, Trent's issued the decree on justification, which gives us the rubber gloves to treat the theological third rail of predestination. But the fight continues, and it's almost always advanced for pastoral reason. So, the first issue in this is Michel de Bay, or Bias, who is a professor at Louvain, and he was a theological advisor during Trent. And he started a personal ad fontes quest in Scripture and the Fathers, in especially Augustine in order to counter the Protestants, and his Ad Fontes quest followed mostly the grumpy anti-Pelagian Augustine writings. And so the way that he was reading Augustine had Augustine being read very close to the denial of free will. Bias would be condemned by Pius V, although the wording was very careful, and the condemnation won't effectively end the debate. Bias repented of his mistake, but he did privately held that he read Augustine the right way. One scholar that was really upset over the direction of Bias's thinking was the Jesuit Luis de Molina at Salamanca. While, of course, he agreed that salvation is a gift from God, Molina wanted to strengthen the importance of human will and action in the process of salvation, and therefore he proposed something called the middle knowledge of God, which is sort of like a mental laboratory where God works out how we will respond. He does give us grace, effective grace, or if he gives us grace, how will we respond? And then once he sees how we will respond, he gives to those that will respond well efficacious grace, which will lead us to salvation in actuality, or sufficient grace to those who aren't going to respond to it properly. So this attempt to strengthen the role of the human will made many upset, particularly Dominicans, such as Domingo Baines, who attacked Molina very vigorously. And so there's lots of accusations of the Jesuits of being Pelagians and the Dominicans of being Calvinists, and the fighting goes back and forth. And this eventually leads to a Congregatio Auxiliis, a congregation of grace, was established to work the issue out. It met for 9 years, from 1598 to 1607, and in the end it couldn't come to a resolution. So Paul V in 1607 told everybody, boys, stop fighting, stop calling each other heretics, and I'll get back to you. It's now almost 410 years, well, 413 years since that, and we're still kind of waiting for the Pope to get back to us on this congregation of grace. So the big issue that continues to burn through the minds of the early modern period is this question of our relationship to grace. How do we respond to grace? Can we resist grace? These questions continue even with the Council of Trent to flow their way through the Catholic world. This brings us to yet another person who thinks he can read Augustine the right way and that Bias was correct, and this is Cornelius Jansen, who after his death, a text is published called the Augustinus, which once again reads primarily the anti-Pelagian tracts of Augustine, emphasizing the brokenness of human nature, and has a robust view of predestination that borders on double predestination. In addition, the writings of Jansen also double down on the seriousness with which one needed to be a Christian. And it is in this side of Jansenism, this constant introspection, this need for self-control, the shunning of the pleasures of life, that we get a Catholic version of Puritanism, close to double predestination and yet morally rigorous to the point of austerity and not enjoying the things of this world in any way. So the most indicative kind of teaching of Jansen and later of Jansenism is that his firm belief that attrition is not sufficient for you to be sorry. You can't just be scared of punishment in order to gain forgiveness. You have to genuinely receive the grace of contrition in order to be forgiven of your sins. He also started the attack on the Jesuits for being too lax in their moral theology. This perspective of Cornelius Jansen, especially of the moral rigor side of things, is going to make important inroads with the elite in France, and I'll return to it in connection with the development of Gallicanism in the absolute state. But we can say that the early modern theological debate over soteriology goes on, and hopefully you'll hear more about that in your classes about soteriology. But the debate remains unresolved, although there's not really a whole lot of Molinists left. There's not really a whole lot of people that support Molina these days. All right, what unites all these various strands of intellectual endeavors at the time is a quest for capital T truth and lowercase t truth. It's an attempt to make sense out of a world which had gone crazy, a world that had been vastly expanded thanks to the age of discovery and had been turned upside down because of the Protestants. And so all of these are attempts to make sense out of the world, whether through a telescope or a return to the fathers. Everyone was looking for the great reset button that would bring harmony once again. But the quest for that button kept bringing up new trajectories and new issues. Everyone tried to go hit the reset button and go back to the way things were, but you can't step into the same river twice. And so their quests launched new initiatives and new imperatives. So Rene Descartes may have locked himself in a closet to reinvent the cosmos, but what he discovered is that he didn't hit the reset button. He just started in a brand new trajectory himself that would continue to influence Catholic thought and European thought in general. And so the early modern period is full of lots of intellectual energy, and in that, it's Baroque. It's full, it's active, it's diverse, it's sometimes disharmonious to look at this wide panoramic of both natural philosophy and of theology at the same time. It's energetic, it's contradictory, it battles with each other, but it is all dedicated to the goal of early modern Catholicism, which is the pursuit of truth and the getting people to believe in that truth. Thank you.